Hello, dear friends. We are parshat Hanan. I'd like to reiterate some things that I said at the Minyan and Shayarot here in Jerusalem, at the synagogue there. In parshat Hanan, we have two very famous passages which have been incorporated into the prayer service. The most obvious one is the Shma, which we say in the mornings and the evenings. That's in Devarim chapter 6. And it's also we also follow it with Devarim chapter 11 by Yom Shamoah. And then we have, of course, the Ten Commandments reiterated a second time. Just somebody once explained, it's good to say things a second time, because if you say them only once, maybe they don't take you seriously. Of course, the Shema was only said once, but I'll get back to that point a little bit later. Now, the Aseret Dibrot, the Ten Commandments, were originally incorporated into the morning service, but then taken out, so that people shouldn't say that's the only important part of the Torah. Whereas the Shema is, of course, a mitzvah from the Torah to recite in the morning and the evening, because it says B'shoch bara v'kumecha. But the Ten Commandments have been incorporated into things that we read. Not only do we read it, of course, twice in the Torah because we come to it, but also on the Shavuot, the holiday which is called Zman Matan Toratenu, the giving of the Torah. We read the decalogue, the Ten Commandments, because the giving of the Torah is really the encounter between God and Israel at Sinai. And what comes after is the details. So the goal of the Torah is to create this encounter. Kol gadol velo yasaf. A voice which never stops to echo. It's never interrupted. It says at Sinai. What is the difference between these two? Remember, Devarim is the book that is Moses' last speech to the people of Israel. It's also happening towards the end of the 40 years. And Eile Hadvarim, these are the words that Moses spoke to Israel. So even though we believe it's divinely originated through what's called the prophecy of Moses, according to the Maharal of Prague, there's still an aspect where it's close to Moses, this particular fifth book. It's sort of like divinely sanctioned, but on the other hand, also there's sort of an input from Moses, who is, of course, the highest prophet that ever was in Israel, and according to Maimonides, ever will be. So what does it say? Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Know, Israel, that the Lord, that our God, this Lord will be one, and meaning known as one and universal by everybody on the planet. That's the way Rashi explains it. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. Now, that's a very high standard to tell everybody they have to love God. You know, the Talmud in Brachot, on the verse where Moses says to the Jewish people, V'atay Yisrael, and now, O people of Israel, Ma Hashem Elohecha doresh mimach. What does God actually demand from you? Rak lirat Hashem Elohecha, only to fear Him and to keep His mitzvot, His precepts. Talmud says, wait a sec, what does it mean? What does God demand from you? Only to fear. Fear of God is so easy. It's such an easy level to reach. Is that what Moses is implying? The Talmud answers yes. For Moses, it's an easy level, and therefore he doesn't understand why the Jews are having such a difficult problem. How can this be compared? If you have a man who has a house full of gold, and somebody asks him for some silver, no big deal. But if you have neither gold nor silver, it's a lot of money. Moses is a visionary. He sees the ideal and he sets the ideal. He sees where the people are, but he's hoping maybe they're following him on his level. So he starts saying, listen, Israel, you know, I taught you the Lord is God, His Lord is one, you know that. And I want to teach you also, the goal is to love God with all your heart, with all your might, with all your soul. But not everybody's able to do that. Right away, the commentators have a difficulty with this. Is this really what Moses is telling? How can you command somebody an emotion? Rashi, most famous commentator, when he explains this verse, Shma Yisrael. So the way he explains it, what does it mean to love God? He says, do things out of love. Meaning, don't do things as if you're forced to do it out of love. So already it has to do with how to fulfill the commandments. There's a midrash says, what does it mean how to love God? To love God, can you command a person emotion? The midrash says, Shem Shamay Mita Hev Al Yadecha. Let the name of God be beloved by your actions. Meaning, if you're an observant person and you're acting in a way where people are really impressed, they'll say, wow, I want my kids to be like that too. So then the name of God will be beloved. So again, but they have difficulty with the actual idea that he's saying to the people to love God. That's a level. Maybe they're not on that level. And then, of course, he continues, and this is also one of the ways. And then he says, and may these words be engraved on your heart and teach them to your children. Others explain, what does it mean to love God? Studying the words of the Torah. And through the studying the Torah, that will bring you to the love of God, like Maimonides says in his Yesodei Torah. But and then of course, and you shall bind them to your hands and put them on your head, which refers to the tefillin, and put it on your doorpost, which refers to the mezuzah. So Moses is starting from a very high standard, raising the bar quite high. According to Rav Levi Nachmani, of blessed memory, a very special, unique rabbi who lived here in Jerusalem about 20 years ago. He said that we have to take this in context of the 2 paragraphs of Shema, because our rabbis see a continuum between Devarim 6 and Devarim 11, Deuteronomy 11, which is the paragraph called Vehayim Shamoa. And this paragraph we also recite together with this first paragraph. We can call it the recitation of the Shema, which we say in the mornings, in the tefillah, and in the evenings. So, and this is Devarim chapter 11, verse starts from 13. And what does it say there? It says, and if you shall listen to my mitzvot, my commandments, which I am commanding to you today, to love God with all your heart and all your soul, and then I shall give the rain on time, etc. There are a lot of things here which are very similar to the Shema, so that makes sense why it was put together. Also the mentioning of the tefillin, the mentioning of the mezuzah. But Rabbi Nachmani explained it this way. He said, Moses is aware there's some people who can live on the level of loving God. Then there's some people who can't. So he says to them, look, if you can't live on that level, at least observe my commandments. If you can't live on the level of love of God, observe the commandments. They'll bring you back. This is actually very similar to our midrash. There's a midrash on Eicha, on the scroll of Eicha, Lamentations, on the verse, Oti azvu v'torati lo shamaru. They left me and they did not keep my Torah. The midrash says, Halavai, that they, even if they left me, at least they should keep my Torah, because the radiance of its light will bring them back to the fold. So they're the mitzvot. Have the ability then to teach the person the right way. And if you teach the right way, you might get the point after a while. It's like somebody once said that even if somebody once said, I'm an agnostic. I don't know if I believe in God, but I like to live my life as if I do. Because that teaches a person to live an ethical life. Because unfortunately, life is based on a paradox. And the paradox is very deep. The paradox that you are born in order to die. You might say it almost in a comic way, life is a terminal disease. And how does a human being live with such a paradox? We only live with it because there's quite a bit of time between birth and death. Sometimes I say either you believe, and that helps you with the paradox, or you need a psychologist, one of the two. but that we live constantly with the friction of this paradox, with the burden of this paradox. So, but belief in God is to teach us to be ethical. There are different levels of ethics, as Rabbi Cook says. There's ethics between man and man. There's ethics between man and God, which is a higher level, a more sensitive level, which the Torah tries to teach us. Because Musar HaTeva and Musar HaKodesh. They're different levels. And this brings me back to the Ten Commandments, the decalogue, which Moshe reiterates in this week's parsha, Va'et Chanan. What is it about the Ten Commandments which is so special? First of all, coming from God, it deals directly with the people as a people. Understanding where they are and what their capabilities as a people are, not just as individuals. If you look at the Ten Commandments, there are two luchot. There are two tablets. According to the Talmud, they're equal in height. So they're equal in height, equal in weight. And one of them is between the commandments between man and God. Second 5 are the commandments between man and man. So what are the ones between man and God? To believe in God, not to believe in idols, not to take God's name in vain, to keep the Sabbath, and to respect your parents. Talmud says, what does respect your parents have to do with man and God? Hukash kvodan lichvod shamayim, Talmud says in Sanhedrin. They're sort of like partners in bringing you, and God is their partner in bringing you into the world. So they are paralleling the honor of heaven, because there are 3 partners. There's your father, your mother, which bring the body, and God, which brings the spirit of life into you, the soul. And so therefore, when you learn to respect your parents, it's also part of learning to honor God. The other 5 are, of course, lo tirtzach, not to murder, not to commit adultery, not to steal, not to bear a false testimony, and not to covet something which is not yours, which I talked about in another video about the 10 Commandments, about the decalogue. So you have 2, between man and God, between man and man, but they're equal tablets to tell you that these are equal mitzvot, commands. It's not as if the commands between man and God are more important than the ones between man and man. The Torah she sees equal value to them. Unfortunately, there is a mentality that affects people, and unfortunately even Jewish people, mentality that seems to emphasize the aspects between man and God over between man and man, specifically among Orthodox Jews sometimes, within our fold. Well, for instance, I'll give you an example. Let's say you saw somebody walking through the airport and they sort of looked religious, and they have this coat and they're going through the customs and they go through the green line, and then the customs officer says, please open your coat. And he opens his coat and there's all this stuff that he didn't declare. Somebody saw that, they said, oh, that religious guy, he's a thief. But if you saw the same religious guy, now I'll talk from a Jewish perspective, sitting in a restaurant eating pork, you wouldn't say that's a religious guy eating pork. You'd say he's not religious. He's just pretending. Why couldn't you say when you saw him stealing that he's not religious, he's just pretending? Because we have this crazy idea as if religion is first and foremost things between man and God. But the Torah doesn't explain it that way. The Torah does not differentiate between not stealing and not lying and keeping Shabbat or idolatry or refraining from idolatry. It's all Torah commands. There's no differentiation. People make those differentiations. So the first thing to tell you is that the mitzvot between man and man, the mitzvot between man and God are on equal basis. They stand on equal ground. That's number 1. Actually, if you look at the decalogue, 6 of them actually look like they are things which we call mitzvot sichliot, rational mitzvot, which people understand. Because aside from the 5 between what I said, between man and man, honoring your parents, people can understand that. Okay, if your parents were abusers, that's a certain exception, but I'm talking about in general, regular parents with their pluses and minuses. People understand. They brought us up. They stayed up late at night. They brought us, spent a lot of time bringing us into the world. So a certain amount of respect, of course, is necessary there. So 6 out of 10. In fact, the only representative of what we call the mitzvot Shim'iyot, as Saadia Gaon calls it, or if you want to call it the ceremony mitzvot, is the Shabbat, which is representing the Shabbat, the holidays, and all other things in the 10 Commandments. Because the first 3 are directly about relationship with God. You see, it's almost like the 10 Commandments is trying to teach us, first, work on the ability to be a good person. Because if you can't be a good person, you cannot continue on the next step. The next step is doing the things that have to do with the inner world, like keeping Shabbat and the holidays and belief in God. But if you're lying to people and stealing from people and committing adultery and murdering, you'll never go up the ladder because you'll never understand it. If you can't understand the basics, how do you want to understand the advanced? You cannot build a building without a strong basis, or else everything will crumble. Many years ago, I was asked to fill in as a substitute teacher in a school in Even Shmuel here in Israel. Fellow was in the military duty, so I filled it in for him. And it was an 8th grade class. And they were studying Vayikra, Leviticus 19. And I said to the class, how do you know that you're not allowed to gossip or to badmouth somebody? Right away, kid puts up his hand, Lo telech rachil ba'amecha, right? Don't say things that you're not allowed to say. Lo teshakru, don't lie. Yeah. Says right there in the Torah. And then I said, if the only reason you can think of not gossiping and not lying about people is because of a verse in the Bible and the Torah, unfortunately, you're going to do it. If you don't understand the danger and the damage of character assassination and of cancel culture and of destroying a person's reputation, how awful and evil that is, how these people want to crawl up and leave the world. If you don't understand the damage, unfortunately, the verse that's there to remind you won't help. Because you have to understand what the Torah is teaching. So it's not enough the verses. It has to enter your mind and your heart and be part of you. And this brings me back now to the 10 Commandments, the decalogue. Moses is saying this for a second time, of course. He's reiterating it. He says, lay more, as God has said. Why is he reiterating it now? Because this is the new generation. It's the end of the 40 years. Remember, God said that whole first generation has to die off in the desert because of the sin of the spies and the golden calf. The new generation has to enter the land. This is now the new generation. This is Moses' final talk to the Jewish people before Joshua will take them into the land. That's why for the first 3 parshat, he keeps talking about how you're going to enter the land. He wants that generation that was not at Sinai to realize that God spoke to them as well. Because I was there, said Moses. I was there between God and you. I was standing there. I'm going to tell you word for word what he said. There's only one thing I can't tell you, and that was the first, meaning I can't tell you in the way it actually happened, because those first 2 of the decalogue, God said directly to you as a people. After the second one, you ran away, as Moses says here in Devarim and Bet Hanan. You ran away. You were afraid. So I continued. God spoke to me. I related to you. So that first 2, I can't relate to you the way God did, because that was an experience, and that experience your parents had, but I can't explain to you because you were not at that experience. But I'll tell you what God said. And if you live your lives right, maybe you'll feel that experience. Maybe you'll understand that the Torah is kol gadol velo yasaf. It is a voice that continues from generation to generation and never stops. And never stops. I once said to somebody who was having a difficulty understanding mitzvot, but knew quite a bit. I said to him, you're like a fellow who ordered a car, a brand new luxury car through IKEA. So you got all the parts, but you have to put them together. The Torah is giving you all the parts through the commandments, but in the end, you have to use your inner understanding and your intuition to understand how the parts formulate you into a real human being. That the Torah is the kol gadol velo yasaf. That is this voice that continues from generation to generation. So Moses says, I'm reiterating the words, but now you have to feel the voice. And that will transform you. Shalom, shalom.